Hello everyone, Mr. Haines again. This video is now going to focus on key topic 2 of the Cold War, specifically looking at the crises that took place from 1958 to 1970. We're going to be looking at 3 main crises during this period and on this PowerPoint. We're going to look at the Berlin crisis of 1961. That is essentially the building of the Berlin Wall. Then we're going to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis from 1962, which is the point where the Cold War is very, very close to becoming what's called a hot war, with actual conflict. And then the final crisis we're going to look at is the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which takes place in 1968. So let's crack on. Okay, so let's start with the first crisis of this video, which is the building of the Berlin Wall. Now, to really kind of understand its importance, we really need to go back towards 1945, the end of the Second World War. Berlin has been a huge source of tension between the Western Allies, so the British, the French, and the Americans, and the Eastern side, obviously the Soviet Union. Okay. In 1949, you have the creation of what's called the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, and then the Democratic Republic of Germany, which is East Germany. So Germany itself is now divided, and Berlin is about to find itself in the same boat. Now, the Soviet Union just wanted Berlin to themselves. Berlin was deep in the Soviet section when the country was divided at the end of the war, and it is deep now in East Germany. It is a part of East Germany geographically, and the Soviets think it should be theirs. You know, they believe it's in their sphere of influence, so the Western Allies should just leave. Obviously, this is not what the Western Allies, particularly the Americans, want to see happen. They want to remain in West Berlin because it is massively advantageous to them. Now, why did we get to a point then where the tension over the city reaches such proportions that we end up building a wall? Well, what was the cause of the Berlin Wall? Let's find out. So, first and foremost, there's an economic disparity between East and West. Now, you have a scenario where people in West Berlin are really enjoying the fruits of an economic miracle. In the post-war years, West Germany, and therefore West Berlin, are economically doing very well. Industry is booming, there is consumer goods for the first time, there is plenty of food, there is plenty of options for food and everything else on shop shelves, and life is pretty good in West Germany and in West Berlin. On the other side, it's not as good. So in East Germany and East Berlin, there is shortages of basic goods. It is just not as enjoyable and as good as it is in the West, and it's obvious to see that. It's so obvious, in fact, that what happens is you get what's called a brain drain. So the people in West Berlin, they see the good life that's going on in West Germany, West Berlin, and they start to leave. They start to go to West Germany. The easiest place to do this if they're living in East Berlin is to just walk across the city. Okay, now this is a bit of a problem because most of the people that are leaving, and between the years of 1945 and 1960, you've got 2.7 million people leaving. Most of these people are young, skilled, professional people, the type of people you need to get your country going, to make your economy work, to build things, to design things, to educate, to police, to protect. You need these people. And it was just gonna continue. Well, that's what they felt. That's what the Soviets thought was going to happen. It was just going to carry on. And suddenly something had to be done. Now, the second issue was that Khrushchev, he believed that the US were now using their portion of Berlin to send spies into East Berlin and from there into the Eastern Bloc. And he wanted to put a stop to it. Now, Khrushchev, he decides that the best way to do this is to issue the US an ultimatum. He basically says, right, we've done this for enough now, we've done this for 15 years or so, time to go. Time to get out of Berlin. You've got 6 months to get out of Berlin. If you don't get out of Berlin, we're going to go to war. Okay? And in the face of this, this ultimatum, it's just decided that we better have some sit-down summit meetings. The US and the USSR, we should talk. We need to talk. And there are 4 summit meetings that take place. Okay, the first is in May 1959 in Switzerland in Geneva. Now, not a lot happens in this meeting. You get both sides. They put forward proposals for how Berlin should be governed, but no agreement is made. What happens at this meeting? Most important thing is President Eisenhower of the US, he invites Khrushchev to the United States for further talks, which happen the next summit meeting, which is at Camp David in 1959 in September. But again, no agreement is made about Berlin. One thing that does happen, though, is that the Soviets agree to withdraw their 6-month ultimatum over Berlin. Now, this meeting at Camp David, that starts to establish better relations between the two leaders. Okay, they're starting to see some positives, and maybe they can see a way of working together. The next summit meeting is Paris in May 1960. Now, just before the summit begins, the USSR shoot down a US spy plane, okay, as it flew over the Soviet Union. Eisenhower, though, he says, yeah, okay, that was us. You know, what do you want us to say? It's one of those things. He refuses to kind of apologize to Khrushchev for this plane. This enrages Khrushchev, and Khrushchev walks out of the meeting. No decisions made on anything. He just walked out. Now, when it comes to the next meeting, you've got a new president of the United States, and that is John F. Kennedy. He comes in November 1960. He's relatively young. Khrushchev believes he can bully him. He believes his youth and inexperience is going to be a problem, and he believes he can take advantage of that. So the next meeting, Vienna, June 1961. Okay, Khrushchev now takes a tough stance, and he renews the ultimatum from 1959. Kennedy obviously is concerned about this, but he is determined not to appear weak in front of Khrushchev. It's his first proper meeting. He doesn't want to be the president that backs down over Berlin. He wants to be in the same vein as Eisenhower and strong in front of communism. So, following the Vienna summit in 1961, you get the East Germans begin building this wall. They build a wall around West Berlin. They keep it on the East Berlin side, so they're not physically building it on land that is owned by the Western Alliance. Okay, they make sure they're careful not to do that. So on 13th of August 1961, they begin building this wall. Initially, it's just a barbed wire fence, not particularly sophisticated, but gradually it starts to get replaced with concrete. Now, the Allies do nothing to stop the building of the wall. That's key. Okay, it's not being built in West Berlin. It is being built just off the border in East Berlin. Okay, all the movement of individuals from East Berlin into West Berlin, as you can imagine, has now stopped. And you get a point where, for a couple of days after this building, where Soviet tanks and US tanks essentially are facing one another across these divided Berlin streets. Okay, they are just staring at each other, waiting for something to happen. Now, this building of the wall, continues. It gets much more sophisticated, and it becomes very, very difficult for people to actually get over into West Berlin. So the flow of the refugees, the brain drain that we mentioned, was completely reduced. Only a handful of people were able to get across. Between 1961 and 1989, when the wall comes down, only 5,000 people managed to escape between East and West. So, what are the consequences then of this wall? Well, first and foremost, on the Western side, the Western Alliance, they essentially are given this propaganda victory. It showed that the communists had to build a wall to stop people from leaving. It showed that their standard of living was so poor that people just had to leave, and the only way they could do it was to build an actual wall. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the wall becomes this symbol of the division between East and West. Okay, that's probably one of the most important consequences of this. But another important consequence is peace. Peace is still maintained. No one actually goes to war over Berlin. Okay, there is a huge price to pay though for the people. German people, families are split up, travel restrictions are very difficult, and it's really hard for relatives to go and see one another. Now, what's really important though is yes, we have this dividing line between the two sides, but it really does help bring the tension down. Now, the tension for Berlin has always been really, really high, but it actually does the opposite. Okay, you do have a moment where you think maybe this is going to prove a dangerous point, but in fact the tension really comes down. So what happens next is Kennedy, President Kennedy, he visits Berlin in 1963, and he goes on like this almost like a propaganda tour around German cities, and he has to go to Berlin. He goes to Berlin and he makes a famous speech where he famously says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which unfortunately for President Kennedy translates to some in Germany as "I am a jam donut," which is not the desired attitude for a US president when discussing a really important moment of the Cold War. Okay, so now we're going to look at the second crisis of the Cold War, and probably the most important one of all, which is over Cuba. Now, there are a number of issues we're going to discuss regarding Cuba, but suffice to say, this is the point where the Cold War really gets quite serious. There is a moment in 1962 where it is very, very close that the US and the USSR are actually going to come into conflict with one another. Consequences of which, are disastrous for everyone involved, really. So how is it that Cuba, this island off the coast of the United States, how is it that this becomes the most important part of the Cold War? Well, it really starts with a revolution led by a man called Fidel Castro, who was a socialist. He essentially had overthrown a man called Baptista, who was backed by the United States. So before 1959, Cuba had been a friendly country to the United States. It had been American industry, was heavily invested in Cuba, and it wasn't until 1959 that the two countries' relationships really veered off down different paths. Now, why does this matter if America and Cuba aren't particularly friends? Well, it matters for geographical reasons. Okay, Cuba's 90 miles off of the United States, and suddenly you haven't got a country which is friendly to the United States. You've got a country which is an enemy, run by a socialist, run by someone with, not at this point ties with the USSR, but certainly someone with ideological leanings towards them, 90 miles off the coast of the United States. It's not It's not an ideal situation. So the United States are incredibly concerned about Cuba, and they remain so. In fact, even after the Cold War ends, they remain concerned about having this country on their doorstep and what's going on in their country and what they're going to do in that country. So suddenly you have the revolution in 1959. Batista is out, Castro is in, and the US now are trying to work out, okay, well, how do we rectify this situation? How do we get Cuba back on side? Well, the first thing they tried to do, they tried to essentially bankrupt Cuba by refusing to buy their main export, which is sugar. Now, the Cubans obviously they need support. The Americans were providing financial support up until the revolution, so they are in a bit of a pickle. The Cubans now they are facing financial collapse. So what Castro does, he does a deal with the USSR, and they buy Cuba's sugar. That then brings Cuba, the USSR, much closer together. Suddenly you've got an even bigger problem for the United States. Now, after the revolution, Cuba obviously sells off any US-owned properties or companies, and the US, now aware that Castro has these connections with communism, they don't acknowledge him, they don't acknowledge the government, and Cuba is really left in limbo. And it's at this point where the US essentially cut ties with Cuba completely that Castro, Cuba, moved closer to the embrace of the USSR and communism. So the first thing that happens then that really kind of makes Cuba such a critical point of the Cold War is in 1961. So in 1961 you have something called the Bay of Pigs incident. Now this is essentially an attempt by the US to regain control over Cuba. So the way the US try and organize this is through the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which is a part of the US government. Now they try and organize essentially a revolt against Castro, and they try and lead an invasion. Now, what the CIA does, they speak to Cuban people in America, so Cuban exiles, and they say, okay, will you help lead an invasion of Cuba? So they get 1,400 of these Cuban nationals, now these Cuban exiles, and they organize them together to invade Cuba. Now, at the same time as this, there was hope that there would be an uprising against Castro by the Cuban people. Okay, so you have essentially a two-pronged attack: the uprising within Cuba and the invasion by the Cuban exiles. So, what happens then with this plan? It's a total and utter failure for the US, and a really embarrassing moment for President Kennedy. Really, really embarrassing. So, first of all, with the uprising within Cuba, people underestimate how popular Castro actually is. He's loved by the people of Cuba. Okay? There's no uprising. People are not going to force him out. It's just not going to happen. The second failure was the exiles. When they land in Cuba, they think they can just, essentially join up with the uprising and then march all the way to Havana. The problem is, when they get there, these 14,000 Cuban exiles, they're faced with the Cuban army, which is 20,000 soldiers. And they are fanatical in their support for Castro and for their country. They are ready to defeat these exiles and end this invasion. And that's exactly what happens. The consequences of all this then, it just pushes Cuba and the USSR closer and closer together. Castro's panicking, Castro's paranoid. It's not just the Americans that are concerned about this, the geography between the two countries. It's the Cubans. Castro's concerned. They don't have support but from a close neighbor. They don't have that security of having an ally close to them. So they go closer to the USSR. In May 1962, they go so close to the USSR they agree with the Soviets to put nuclear weapons on their island. Soviet nuclear weapons are to be placed onto Cuba. What he finally does to ingratiate himself with the communists and with the Soviet Union, Castro, far from being a socialist, he now declares himself to be a communist. He goes the whole hog. He is fully in the embrace of Khrushchev. He says he will help the USSR in any way he can, and vice versa. Khrushchev says the same for the USSR. Now, once you have that agreement in place that the Soviet nuclear weapons are going to stay on Cuba, again, you've got a bit of a problem there. It's only going to take a matter of time before somebody finds this out. Now, when we spoke about the conferences regarding the Berlin Wall, the US had a pilot that had been shot down by the USSR. This pilot was a spy. He was taking pictures of the USSR. Now, obviously, the US are going to do the same over Cuba. They know Cuba is fully in the embrace of Khrushchev and the Soviets, so they start flying over Cuba, taking pictures. What they do when they take these pictures, they realize that the Cubans are now building missile sites that can one day house missiles, and not just any missiles, nuclear warheads. Now, this all takes place during a period of time which is now called the 13-day crisis of 1962. Now, these are the 13 days which lead up to the main crisis, which is, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's on October the 14th, 1962, the US spy plane goes over Cuba, taking these photos, and people realize what's going on. Now, in the preceding days, it's a really fraught period. The US really don't know what is the best course of action here. If you invade Cuba, you're then essentially declaring war on an ally of the Soviet Union. That then could precipitate nuclear conflict with the Soviets. That is not what anybody wants. The problem is, they've already failed massively with the Bay of Pigs. What they need to do, what the Americans really need, is a win. They need a solution to this problem that not only protects everyone, that doesn't cost a life. They need a solution that means Kennedy wins some respect back. Respect that he lost during the Bay of Pigs. Now, about a week after they have possession of these photos and they understand what's going on, Kennedy then decides the best course of action, after long chats with his advisors. He decides the best thing we can do is a naval blockade around Cuba. That way, we can prevent these missiles and equipment from reaching Cuba. Now, it would also mean that the Americans would have to search any suspected ship carrying arms or missiles. So it is incredibly tense and fraught thing that they're about to do, because you are potentially riling up the Soviet Union so much that they might in fact go to war themselves. Now, that decision is made on 20th of October 1962. 21st of October, you have Kennedy now talking directly to the American people. He's telling them about this threat and what he intends to do. A couple of days after that, on the 23rd, Khrushchev sends a letter to Kennedy insisting that the Soviet ships, this is the key here, they would force their way around the blockade. They're not going to back down. Kennedy obviously doesn't want to back down. He doesn't want to get embarrassed again in the first again in 2 times in 18 months. He doesn't want that to happen. But Khrushchev is not going to do it either. That's a problem. Now, 24th of October, Khrushchev now issues his own statement. He insists that the Soviet Union would use nuclear weapons in the event of a war. The next day, Kennedy writes back to Khrushchev and says, take these missiles from Cuba. You've got to get rid of these missiles. The next day, it goes on like this. Khrushchev now sends a reply. He says he would withdraw the missiles from Cuba. But there's a problem. There's a problem for the Soviet Union. The problem is that they've got to deal with the American hypocrisy here. And it is hypocrisy because the Americans have got missiles in Greece and they've got missiles in Turkey as well. So this is a problem. The Soviets essentially just want to do what the Americans are doing in Greece and Turkey. Surely that should be okay. You've got your missiles in Greece, we've got our missiles in Cuba. Now, the next day comes along, you get the 27th of October. Another US spy plane goes over Cuba. This one is actually shot down. So the tension you can feel is incredibly high. 27th of October, 1962, the real high point of the Cold War. Let's call it what it is. Not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's the high point of the Cold War. You get a plane shot down amongst all this other tension regarding the blockade. It's a real crisis point. Now what happens is you get Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. They now propose a deal with the Soviet Union. Okay, you want us to withdraw these missiles? We'll withdraw the missiles from Turkey. But as long as that is kept secret. And that way, you will turn around when you get to the blockade, or you will just turn around and you will go right back to the USSR and missiles will not be put on Cuba. The final day, 28th of October, Khrushchev accepts the deal. He accepts the deal and then suddenly everyone can breathe this sigh of relief. Oh, thank God that's over. That was really worrying for a period. Now, what's the consequences then of this crisis? Now, this is as close as these two superpowers, the US and the USSR, had ever gone to war. So close. However, reaching that climax, reaching that crescendo, where they both kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, let's not do this. That actually, conversely, leads to better relations, and they're actually a lot closer after this point, the two countries. How does this manifest itself? Well, you actually get a hotline now. Telephone communication is set up between Moscow and Washington so that their leaders could speak directly. I think one of the issues around the 13 days is that you're sending letters, you're interpreting letters. Okay, suddenly now you've got a telephone, you can call, you can speak directly, one-on-one, if anything like this happens again. Another consequence is that Khrushchev now seems to have failed. He is the one at this point who is embarrassed. He's backed down in the face of American pressure. And Kennedy, conversely, finally, he gets his big win. He gets his win. He's the hero of the Western world. Now, the public don't know about the removal of US missiles from Turkey. All they know is Soviet ships turned around. That's what happens. That's the thing that Kennedy wanted the most. And then in the aftermath of all this, you start to get actual treaties signed. Now, if you think about the conferences from the Berlin crisis, where it was difficult to get the participants in the same room, suddenly now in the 1960s, on the back of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that point where they all realise this is a bit serious, You now get treaties being signed between these two nations. 1963, you get the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Both the USSR and the Americans agree to stop testing nuclear weapons above ground and underwater. Then in 1967, you get the Outer Space Treaty, where again, Americans, USSR, together with the British and several other countries, they promised to use outer space for peaceful purposes and not to place nuclear weapons in orbit. Now, don't forget, this is a period of space exploration. In 2 years' time, you'll have Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong. So this is a real serious consideration at this point. People think they could put nuclear weapons in space. Finally then, 1968, you get the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is designed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons to countries that should not really have them, and to stop the building of and the testing of these weapons. The final thing which actually makes a big difference is cooperation. They start to cooperate with each other. The US begin selling grain to the USSR. So they're actually almost a trading partner for each other at the moment. They're actually working together on something that is beneficial. So you go from this point of having the most incredible tension to something positive coming out between it. Kennedy now looks like the hero. Khrushchev looks like the loser in all of this. But the two superpowers have come out the other side, and they've realised that the risk of nuclear war is just not worth it. So, hot on the heels of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you get an event which really goes some way to undoing all the good that had come out of the end of that particular crisis. You know, where you have a scenario where the two superpowers are closer than ever, really, in spite of being so close to war. Now they're quite close. They've got trade links, they've signed treaties, there's direct communication for the first time. But we have an event in 1968 which really tarnishes a lot of that legacy, and that is the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, to really think about how this manifests itself, we need to go again back a few years to see how things had been set in train and how things had played out ever since the Soviets had kind of taken over control, for want of a better word, of Czechoslovakia. Now, during the 1960s, there was growing opposition to Soviet control, much like there had been in East Germany and also, of course, in Hungary. Okay, so the leader of the Czechs since 1957 was a man called Antonin Novotny. Okay, he was a very hard-line communist. And he was very unpopular because he refused to bend. He was inflexible. Communist. Okay, he did not want to reform anything within the Czech state. And by the 1960s, you get a declining economy. You get the Czech economy is in serious decline. As obviously happens when this happens, you get a fall of living standard. It's a pattern that happens across Eastern Europe. Standards of living are not comparable to the West. And what happens is the people within Czechoslovakia, they start to demand greater say. They want more democracy. They want more reform. They want better than they're getting. And this is what happens. And they get that through a man called Alexander Dubček. Okay, now he is elected in 1968. He is initially approved by the Soviet leadership. They think he can make the Czechoslovakian economy turn around, make the country more effective, more prosperous, and as a devout communist, they're committed to the Warsaw Pact. So even though Dubček is a reformer, so to speak, he's trusted by the Soviets. They're not leaving the Warsaw Pact. He is a communist through and through. Now, what his aim was to establish what he called communism with a human face. And this was wildly celebrated across the country. He wanted to have a program of reform that included changes to the constitution, that would have been able to improve the level of democracy that was missing from people's lives, allowing people greater personal freedoms. These reforms became known as the Prague Spring. He announced that he wanted the Czechoslovakian Communist Party to remain the main party in Czechoslovakia, of course. He's a communist through and through. But he wanted the oppressive, let's say, Muscovite aspects of the party to be reduced. He wanted the Communist Party members in Czechoslovakia to be given the right to change and to challenge Central Soviet Party policy. In doing so, he announced the end to censorship and the right of Czech citizenships to criticize the government. It's the cornerstone of democracy to be able to criticize your government. Dubček wanted this for the Czechs. With this, the press in Czechoslovakia, they start to run with things. They start to say, okay, well, let's write what we really want to write. If our leader says we can do it, let's do it. So newspapers now, they take the opportunity and they produce scathing reports about how useless their government is, and how corrupt they are. They are really going to town on how bad the central government is. Let's not forget that the central government is the Communist Party. The newspapers are now openly criticizing the Communist Party. So therefore, they are openly criticizing Central Russian policy. They're openly criticizing them. The next thing that happens, you have trade unions. Again, really important part of a functioning democracy. They now are given the rights to say to their members, if you want to go on strike, you are able to organize that if you so choose. Now, this sort of thing has never been tried in the Soviet countries. They are really going very far with these reforms. But the Czech people are absolutely over the moon. This is what they want. This is what they've been waiting for. Finally, a chance to live a free, prosperous life with less oppression and less discrimination. So how do the Soviets respond to this change in Czechoslovakia? Well, the first thing that happens is Dubček assures Moscow. He says, you've got nothing to worry about. We're all good. We're staying in the Warsaw Pact. You've got nothing to worry about. Everything's fine. All good. Now, unsurprisingly, this doesn't necessarily reassure the Soviet leadership. The Soviets now are being led by a new leader, Leonid Brezhnev. Now, he is not happy with what's going on in Czechoslovakia at all. Now, it becomes a lot more serious for the Soviets and for him when in the wake of the Prague Spring, the wake of the relaxation of rights for people. First of all, Romania, they refused to attend Warsaw Pact meetings, and then the next thing that happens is the Yugoslavian leader, a man called Tito, he doesn't want control anymore from Moscow. He just says, no, well, if it's going on in Czechoslovakia, it's going to go on where we are. So suddenly, it's a problem for the Soviets. It's a clear problem. Control is everything. And if they lose control of one, there's a domino effect that could happen. Czechoslovakia goes, then Romania goes, Yugoslavia, etc., etc. And then everything falls apart. So the Soviets have to deal with this in much the same way that they dealt with Hungary. So 20th of August 1968, the Soviets send over 500,000 troops who enter Czechoslovakia and essentially put a stop to the Prague Spring. Understandably, there's little opposition to the invasion. Czech people couldn't really do anything to stop it. Their army were told to stay back and not attack the Soviets. A few people would try to block roads or attacked individual tanks with petrol bombs, and some buildings were set on fire to slow the Soviets down. But ultimately, there was not a lot that could be done to stop it. So it was done pretty quickly, pretty efficiently. And with that, the Prague Spring was over. The invading forces were told, they'd been invited to help restore law and order. They'd been invited to come in. Now, Dubček and the other leaders, you can imagine what happens then. They're arrested, they're taken to Moscow and forced to accept the end of any move to democracy that the Czech people might have. And in the next year, 1969, Dubček is replaced by a man called Gustav Husak. He is a much more loyal hardliner. He is, again, a full-on, paid-up member of the Communist Party, someone who will follow the line from Moscow without question. So what's the overall consequences of this event? Now, as I said at the beginning, this really goes some way to undoing the kind of goodwill that come on the back of the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US now look at Czechoslovakia much they had done before the crisis in Cuba had taken place. They're back to their old ways. So much for the relax of tension. They're doing what they do. So what the Prague Spring and the Soviet response does is reaffirm that the Soviet Union are not even willing to contemplate any member of the Warsaw Pact from leaving. The Warsaw Pact has to remain strong, as the USSR thought it was vital if communism was going to survive in Europe. They thought it was so important. The next thing that happened is Brezhnev, he now outlined the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, this was a Soviet foreign policy which called for the use of Warsaw Pact forces to get involved in any Eastern European country which was seen to kind of compromise or be looking to reform Soviet rule, either by trying to moderate policies or in fact going that far to leave the Warsaw Pact. And it said if one country's action threatens the other countries, it was the duty of all those countries to step in and to stop that from happening. What it also does is it strains the relations between a lot of the communist countries, as mentioned, Yugoslavia and Romania. They condemn the invasion because they had pretenses of their own for similar action. In Western countries, there's still communists in Western countries, so you get the communist parties of Italy and France. They cut links to Moscow. They say, no, you can't do this. You can't go in and tell a committed communist like Dubček to stop what he's doing. That is not what communism is about. Now the US, obviously they're outraged by the invasion, and there's strong protest made to the Soviet Union. There was also an attempt to pass a resolution condemning the invasion, but this was vetoed. At the same time, 1968, the US can't really put its whole weight behind stopping or criticizing the invasion, because they're in a situation where in Vietnam they are fighting essentially an unwinnable war, and actions within Czechoslovakia is not really on the radar of the United States in 1968. It's not what they're interested in. It's one of those points in the Cold War where you just think, well, we got so far down the line, so far to accommodation, so far to having reforms, communism with a smiling face, but suddenly in an instant it's stopped by the Soviets.